Hello friends and welcome to my favourite non-fiction plus one poetry books of 2023. I have a nice neat 10 books to share with you today. However, I have not ranked them. When I put this list together, there was very clearly a couple of strong themes or topics that I've been reading about and enjoying a lot this year. So I just want to talk to you about the books in the order that most makes sense to me. Having said that, what we are going to do is start with my three favorites, because I have seen my retention graphs and I know that only like 30% of you are still here by the end of the video, and I want as many people as possible to know about and hopefully read these books. So this first book is right up here at the front of the video because it is the one that I want people to read. I think it's a book that speaks really powerfully to the moment that we're in right now, but also teaches us so much about the past and where we're heading. It's a book that just really clicked a lot into place for me and taught me a lot. So without further ado, that book is, of course, White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. I read it a couple of months ago and I haven't stopped talking about it since. Now, I am aware that there are quite a few differences between the Australian edition and the US edition. So some of the examples and specific things that she references might be different between those two books, but the overall thesis, the overall message, and I think the overall impact will remain the same. And from what I can tell, this book has been pretty well received internationally, but Ruby got railed in Australia upon its first publication. And why did Australia respond so poorly to this book? Well, because it's about colonization. Essentially, she starts with the concept that I'm sure most of us are familiar with now, and that is of white woman tears. Of white women very actively weaponizing their place in society to harm and to silence people of color. And essentially from this starting point, she then seeks to untangle the history of white supremacy and feminism. She talks about how a lot of women of color just really don't identify with mainstream white feminism and why. And she argues that the creation of the category of white woman as we know it today serves a very particular role and function under white supremacy, and that is intentional. Rather than white women just being innocent bystanders in the racist colonial project who are equally as oppressed by patriarchy as people of color are by racism, Ruby instead kind of re-centers white womanhood and the category of white womanhood as a kind of linchpin in these systems. And she talks about the ways in which this is so harmful across the globe, whether it's, black women in America to indigenous black and brown men in places like Palestine or Australia. But she also talks about how this essentially entrenches white women's own oppression under patriarchy. Because the only way that we hold on to our privilege of whiteness is by participating in the oppression of other people. And she gives plenty of incredible historical examples, one being here in this country, the active role white women played in the genocide and assimilation of Aboriginal children through the stolen generations. The way that she spoke about the history and our current conceptions of rape, and the way that white supremacy and racism plays such an integral part to our understanding and framing of all of that even today. And while yes, this book definitely is a calling out of white feminism and white women, which I know is a large part of my audience, if you are open to reading this, honestly, I found this liberating and empowering in a way that I don't think any other book has done for me. And while I think I kind of knew a lot of this beforehand, I don't think I had as clear a picture and understanding before reading this book. For the most part, white women have very diligently been playing their role within white supremacy. What we get in return is white privilege and our proximity to white men, but what we sacrifice in order to hold on to that is so much greater. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I just think this is such a thorough and incredible, but also very accessible work of anti-colonialism that I think everybody should read. The next book I want to tell you about is probably my personal favorite, if that makes sense. It's Raja Shehadeh's Going Home. Now, Palestinian Walks by Raja Shehadeh, which is kind of the precursor to this book, is one of my favorite books of all time, and this is just going to sit very comfortably alongside that book. Raja is a Palestinian lawyer who lives in Ramallah, and essentially in this book he is taking a walk on the anniversary of the occupation, and as he's walking through the streets he's reflecting on the changes that he's seen throughout his city, and also just reflecting on the past and the current reality of occupation. He's reflecting about his role as a lawyer in resistance to Israeli occupation and genocide. He's reflecting on some of the limitations and perhaps failures of that resistance, and also kind of allowing himself to imagine what might be in the future. And all of that is grounded in the reality of him aging and becoming an old man. I just genuinely adore Raja's writing. We get a bit of the nature writing and the walk writing with this memoir, as well as some history too. And it's all just interwoven in this really kind of gentle, seamless narrative that I can't put down. And it always feels so intimate. It feels like he's talking to you. These books almost feel like a conversation, but there's also this elevated like grandness to them too. Honestly, for me as a reader, this is a near perfect nonfiction book, and I just want to read everything Raja has ever written. The third thing I wanted to point out as one of my favorites of the year is actually a poetry collection. It's far and away my favorite poetry collection of the year, and it is Rifqa by Mohammed el-Kurd. This is an absolute gut punch of a poetry collection. The language and the way that he plays with form from time to time I found really like interesting and beautiful, and while elements of it were quite vulnerable and tender, the word that I think best describes this collection is defiant. And I don't know about your experience, but for me, I found reading this poetry out loud to be the most potent way to experience it. Mohammed is a Palestinian poet, and Rifqa was the name of his grandmother. And it says on the back, her name was Rifqa. She was older than Israel itself and an icon of Palestinian resilience. And so there are several poems in here that are directly about Rifqa, or where she's kind of like a main character, I suppose. And there's others where she's just kind of like in the background. Some she's not like directly featured at all, but ultimately this is a book about resilience and defiance and resistance, and it's just potent. It was incredible. I loved it. The next book is one that wasn't necessarily a perfect read for me, but it's one I continue to reflect on. I think I've mentioned it in several videos since finishing it. It taught me an awful lot, so I wanted to mention it here. It is We Do This Till We Free Us by Mariame Kaba, Abolitionists Organizing and Transforming Justice. So as it says on the tin, this is a book about abolition, but it's not really written as a book, like it wasn't written from start to finish to be read necessarily from start to finish. Instead, it's a collation and a collection of a bunch of essays and interviews and stuff like that that Mariame has done over the years of organizing. So for that reason, reading it from start to finish in the same way that I did over the course of a day or two, there's definitely some examples and some topics that she brings up time and time again that do get a little repetitive. But equally, I think this is an incredible resource, and as somebody who had not read anything on the topic before, it was an amazing introduction. And there are a handful of essays in particular that just honestly, like I said, have stayed with me and I keep thinking about, and I keep kind of using as frames of reference for the things that I'm experiencing or seeing in the world, which I think is incredible. That's kind of the hallmark of a really powerful work of nonfiction, one that helps you make better sense of your world. There was one particular essay in here that spoke about atrocity and the spectacle of violence, and that is the one that I keep returning to and I keep thinking about over and over. There was an awful lot to like about this, and I really appreciated how entry level this book was without oversimplifying anything. It was very direct and very clear. So it was a great book. I really enjoyed reading it at the time, and I'm just so happy in the months since. Having some of the language that I was introduced to in this book has been very helpful. Next, we have two books by one of my favorite authors. It's Maxine Beneba Clarke. We've got How Decent Folk Behave and The Hate Race. And I'm just realizing this is a poetry collection, so I lied to you. This is a poetry collection, so I have two. I have two poetry collections on this list. This was a collection of poems by Maxine Beneba Clarke that were published in and around like 2020. So essentially Maxine was writing weekly for a paper here in Australia during obviously one of the most turbulent and difficult times socially and personally that a lot of us have been through. And I would say the kind of top three big topics that get referenced again and again throughout, obviously the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, both in terms of, you know, us watching it here in Australia, what was happening in the US, but also how it manifested here too. And then also in Melbourne in particular, there was a string of very public and gruesome murders and rapes of women. And I was actually lucky enough to be able to go to an event where Maxine was talking about this, obviously much later after it was published, after lockdowns and everything ended. And she spoke about how obviously this poetry is less personal than a lot of her previous poetry has been because of the very nature of publishing one piece of poetry every week in a national newspaper. She was really trying to capture the mood and the feeling that we were experiencing collectively, but equally she was very intentional about ensuring that a collective representation of experience did not mean ignoring or silencing people who are marginalized or underrepresented. Honestly, reading this felt really quite cathartic for me. I think kind of seeing our collective experience written down in this nice poetry collection, this kind of succinct collection, really helped me, I don't know, kind of like contextualize everything that we went through. It just feels like this is the perfect encapsulation of all of the absolutely huge feelings, the fear, the anger, the grief, the love, the passion, all of it. The roller coaster that was that very specific time and place. The other book that I read by Maxine this year, I finally got around to reading her memoir with my Blossom Book Club. In this, she essentially goes over her kind of like childhood and young adulthood and her experience growing up Black in middle-class suburban Australia. Again, this was incredible. I absolutely loved it. I always love Maxine's writing, regardless of whether it's in short story form, non-fiction, poetry. I think she just has such an incredible way of capturing and encapsulating a particular experience. And she does that over and over and over again throughout this memoir. It's a hugely powerful one and definitely one I would encourage all Australians to read, but I think people from all over the world would get something out of this too. Now, finally, the last 4 books that I have to talk to you about are all about one topic that I read an awful lot of books about this year. I think I read 14 or maybe 15 books, but these were the top 4. And while I loved all 4, I think my favorite of the lot has to be Neuroqueer Heresies by Nick Walker. The subtitle reads, Notes on the Neurodiversity Paradigm, Autistic Empowerment, and Post-Normal Possibilities. Kind of like Mariame Kaba's book, We Do This Till We Free Us. This is a collection of essays and bits and pieces that Nick has written over decades of advocacy and organizing. But this book did something especially interesting in that often there's like little notes from Nick about like when each piece was written and kind of like the context of it. So I really liked that element. It did just kind of, like I said, contextualize everything, but also just made this feel that little bit more cohesive. Nick was one of the people to coin and popularize the term neuroqueer, which is essentially, very simplistically, the idea of intentionally subverting neurotypical expectations and structures and freeing ourselves of neurotypical supremacy, which obviously impacts neurodivergent people a hell of a lot, but I think it impacts a lot of people in a lot of different ways. So in this collection, Nick is kind of exploring and talking about her conception of neuroqueer, what that meant to her, why she came up with that term. Throughout the book and the different essays, she's both defining her radical conception of neuroqueer as a theory in terms of like academia, but then she's also exploring her own experience with neuroqueering her life, and also the way that this word has kind of like taken on a life of its own. I just loved this book. It wasn't the first book on autism or neurodivergence that I read, but it was the one that just like filled me up. It was defiant and it was hopeful and it was so full of love, and I just loved it. I just loved this book. It's one that I want to reread because I read it so quickly I just couldn't put it down. So I definitely want to return to this in 2024. I loved it. Next up we have Love and Autism by Kerr. Kerr is an author here in Australia who wrote Social Cue, which is one of my favorite young adult books. In this book, Kerr essentially talks about love and relationships from an autistic experience, and she does explore her own thoughts and feelings about this topic, but she also interviews and intersperses the experience of 5 other neurodivergent people as well. So we hear from each of these 5 people throughout the book again and again on different topics. And I just loved the way that this was formatted, where Kerr would like introduce a topic and a concept and kind of explore some of her thoughts on it. And then we would dive into the interviews where she spoke to each of these 5 people about their own thoughts and feelings. So I feel like a lot of books that kind of do that whole like, you know, getting different people's experience, it will kind of like get one person's experience on a particular subtopic, and that will be a chapter. And then we'll talk about the next person and their particular experience. Instead, here, we got to see those 5 people again and again throughout the book. It really felt like we got to know them as people quite well in a lot of ways, but we also got a range of thoughts and opinions and experiences on a bunch of different topics. Obviously, all under the umbrella of love and relationships and connection and friendship and all of that sort of stuff. Sometimes they did touch on harder subjects and the challenges that go along with that, but ultimately, this is a book that felt rooted in autistic pride and celebration, and it just made me so happy to read. Then this one is called Late Bloomer. It's by Clem Bastow, and this is a memoir of getting diagnosed autistic in your adulthood. Clem is Australian. She grew up in Melbourne, so this feels very Australian, which I did really like. I really appreciated. And Clem has a very kind of direct, forthright, defiant tone throughout the book that, again, I just loved. It's basically a coming of age memoir, but the coming of age was around the experience of finally being diagnosed autistic after struggling on and off her entire life. It's funny, it's punchy, sometimes it's sad, but it's always honest, and I just loved it. I loved her tone of voice. I really enjoyed the audiobook narration too. There was also just so much warmth in this book. It almost felt like Clem was like asking us to sit down so that she could chat to us like an older sister who has already struggled through figuring out the ropes and doesn't want you to have such a hard time. And she's just going to tell you how it is, how it really is, so that you've got the information that she wished she'd had. That's the vibe, and I just loved it. And then finally we've got this lovely book by Joanne Limburg. It's called Letters to My Weird Sisters on Autism, Feminism and Motherhood. Essentially, this book is structured into 4 different letters that the author wrote to 4 different women from the past that records indicate may have been neurodivergent in some way, may have been autistic, may have been mentally ill, disabled, or just just a little bit weird. And that is the word that she uses throughout the book because she doesn't want to ascribe, you know, like a modern label to people who, you know, didn't have or didn't identify with that label back then. But basically each of these 4 women, what we know of them, Joanne identifies with their experience in some way. And upon getting an autistic diagnosis well into her adulthood, she writes these letters to these 4 women that she in some ways identifies with. I only knew one of the women. The first letter is to Virginia Woolf. The other 3 women are Adelheid Block, Frau V, and Katharina Kepler. So you might be familiar with some of those people. I did not know them by name. But essentially in each of the letters, she just kind of gets really personal and exploring a particular thing that she's struggling with or thinking about in the wake of her autism diagnosis. And the way that that woman's story from history has like helped her make sense of it, or she just empathizes with them or something. She feels some sense of connection with them, essentially. And so some of the themes that she explores in these letters are topics around like femininity and the performance of femininity, of motherhood and the societal expectations around motherhood. One of the letters also talks a lot about disability, and I think that might have been my favorite. It was so impactful. This was just wonderful. It was so beautifully written. Like I said, it was so open-hearted and honest and tender. And I would say that this book just felt so steeped in a sense of compassion. Like obviously looking back on history and taking the time to really learn about and identify with these different women who had their own challenges. It feels like an exercise in compassion and empathy. One that obviously serves to help the author better understand herself and her own situation. But I think in extending compassion and empathy to others, it encourages us to do the same to ourselves. And I just, I'm going to tear up a little bit thinking about it. I just found this book hugely moving. So those are my 10 favorite nonfiction / poetry books of the year. I would love to hear about your favorite nonfiction books in the comments below. As always, a big thank you goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially a big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And thank you for watching. I will talk to you again very soon. Until then, happy reading. Bye.